Okay, welcome once again. Stiff upper lippers and floppy bottom lippers, I guess would be the appropriate opposite for that one. My name's Danny. This is My Own Worst Enemy, mental health podcast and video podcast now. Okay, so this week we are discussing the topic of resilience. And for regular listeners, you'll know that part of my whole shtick here is during the intros or what have you, I like to kind of throw out a personal anecdote that's got some sort of tenuous link to whatever the topic of the week is. This week, I haven't really got anything for you, I'll be honest. However, what I have got for you is an anecdote which, well, it amused me anyway. So again, regular listeners, you'll know that I'm something of a social rattlesnake, to say the least. I do go out of my way to sort of boast about this fact. And this past week, I took my antisocial behaviour into the stratosphere. So I'm sure lots of you are familiar with Larry David of Curb Your Enthusiasm fame and Seinfeld, all that lot. Well, it's quite a famous story about him. I think it's back in the 70s, 80s when he was a stand-up comic in New York, just getting started. He's very touchy about his audience, and there's one particular time, I think might have done it multiple times, but one story about Susie Essman, who is she's in Curbed with him, plays Jeff's wife. Apparently, she was introducing him on stage this one time, and Larry comes out on stage, scans the audience, has a look at him, and then just says, "Nope, never mind," walks off stage, just because he didn't like the look of him. And I did something very similar this week. So, just recently I've started back at university. Well, not started back because I never went in the first place, but I've started at university at the ripe old age of 35, studying psychology and philosophy. And it's I couldn't afford a brick university. I don't got the time for all that either. So I do something called the Open University, which if you're not in the UK, you're probably not familiar with. It's basically just distance learning, where you get your course materials sort of sent to you in the post, and then you sort of have a tutor that you email and stuff. And but it's legit. It's not like some dodgy course that I've just bought online. It's a proper university. And yeah, part of the whole learning process is they have these like little day schools and stuff that you go to. I'm not sure if it's supposed to foster like a community spirit with the OU or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, we do these little day schools, and there's like local day schools and then regional ones, like these bigger regional ones. And I've done the local ones, and they're the small. It's like 2 hours, and there's like 8 people, and it's fine. But then these regional ones are like 6 hours, like proper school, and a lot more people. However, I didn't know how many more people had be going to this one. And it's not my thing. I don't want to turn up for stuff like that anyway. But I thought, it might be good for the whole learning experience, for my education. And so I went out of my way to do it. So I went to bed early the night before, got up early, had all my clothes ready, my books and my pens and my little notepad and stuff all in my little rucksack ready to go. And then it was nice and early, so I went and got like breakfast from McDonald's, drove into Manchester, right, which is like 30-40 minutes. Had to find parking. Parking's a nightmare in Manchester, right? Had to find parking, and there was none anywhere near the university. Paid for parking, then had to walk to the university, which, for a recovering agoraphobic, I've had more fun times than that. Anyway, I get lost as well because piss fighting about doing roadworks and scaffolding up everywhere, redirecting pedestrians. So anyway, finally get to the university, and I get in there, I'm still early because, dedicated and all that, and I'd set off nice and early. And get in there, there's only one guy there, so this will do me, just me and you here. And I said to him, I don't suppose you've done this before, you know how many people are going to be here. He didn't have a clue, useless. So sat there, people start filtering in, 2 or 3 people, 4, 5, 6, starts getting a bit dodgy. And then after there's about 8 people in, I'm already not happy. I've reached my threshold. And then the tutor turns up. And so I say to her, just asking, I don't suppose you know how many people are going to be here today. She said, we've had 66 people register, so we can probably expect between 50 and 60 people. So I went, nah, stood up, put my coat on, put my bag on my shoulder, walked out, not bothered, right? And I could tell they knew what I was doing, and it was a little bit awkward, but I wasn't bothered. I was quite proud of myself, just went home, went and got back in bed. So, yeah, I'm quite pleased with myself, turning into a little bit of a Mancunian Larry David, I guess you could say. Actually, I guess you could say that I wasn't being very resilient because I couldn't handle being around all those people. Anyway, this week's topic, again, we're talking about resilience. My guest today is Dr. Glenn Schiraldi. Glenn is a graduate of West Point. He is a Vietnam veteran and the founder of Resilience Training International. He has served on the stress management faculties at the Pentagon, at the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and at the University of Maryland, where he received the Outstanding Teacher Award. He is the author of a number of books, including the Self-Esteem Workbook, the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Sourcebook, and the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, which is the Resilience Workbook, Essential Skills to Recover from Stress, Trauma and Adversity. In today's episode, we discuss precisely what resilience is and what it means to be resilient, how resiliency can act as a barrier between mental health issues such as stress, anxiety and depression, and we also give you some tips on how you can build and cultivate resiliency in yourself. If you'd like to learn more about Glenn, you can visit his website, which is resilienceFirst.com. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please go to myownworstenemy.org/podcast. And that's pretty much it. So, as I always say, please enjoy my conversation with Glenn Schiraldi. Okay. Glenn Schiraldi, I hope I've pronounced that right. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Danny, across the pond.
Yes, and it is Schiraldi. I hate pronouncing people's names wrong.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so back on topic a little bit. We've been kind of veering off in all different directions with this podcast recently, but I think this kind of brings us more back to center, this topic, because we're talking about resiliency, whatever that is. But before we go into that, as always, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about you, why I'm speaking to you about resiliency, and how you came to be interested in and study this particular topic, if you would.
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very small town in New York in the States, and I was a baby boomer, and growing up in the late 40s and 50s, it was a very different time. The families were close-knit and intact, and the church and community was strong. And so I got a sense for what could be. And then, of course, we know what happened in the 60s and the 70s. I went off to West Point, and that was during the Vietnam War. And so I saw friends not only die, but friends come back and were troubled, and they weren't the same, and part of them never came back, and I had no clue what was going on or how to help. And then after my active duty, I taught high school for about 3 years, and I saw the young people struggling with suicide and rape and all these things, and again, had no idea how to help, but a real good sense that something was amiss and we needed to do something. After my active duty, I went and joined the faculty at the University of Maryland. They have a very good stress management program. And back then, we thought of stress as just a physical thing that happened when your arousal gets high. And most of stress management attempted to reduce that arousal. But as I trained people would come up afterwards and say, I'm depressed. Does that have anything to do with stress? And where can I put my hands on a good user-friendly book? And same thing with anxiety and anger and self-esteem. And most of the time I had no answer. And so I ended up writing books for the layperson. And eventually I said, okay, got to get my arms around this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which happens following rape and war and hurricanes and so forth. And that was about a 5-year research and writing project. And then I felt like I got my arms pretty much around the negative side of stress. And then on the campus at the University of Maryland, 9/11 hits, and 2 weeks later, a tornado rips through campus and kills several people, and the kids are walking around shell shocked. And so I decided we needed to build upon our coping courses that I'd been developing at Maryland. And so I pulled together the best from the Pentagon training that I co developed and added to that research from the resilience and trauma literature, and, uh, and put together a course that was basically among the first resilience training courses for normal functioning people, young adults mostly, but of any age. And we found that everything changed in the direction we hoped. Resilience significantly and to a large degree changed in its correlates: happiness, self esteem, optimism, curiosity, while all the bad stuff went down: anxiety, depression, and anger. And so that was really good news, that you really could build resilience and in the process kind of make people mentally healthier. Um, and so I ended up writing a book, kind of pulling together all of that experience. It's called the Resilience Workbook. And I guess I should have mentioned in the late 90s, I started training high risk groups, military, cops, firefighters, who have I think, a special need to be equipped with strong coping skills. And so I got to hone my craft a bit and learn how you improve people's resilience. Um, and so that's where I am today. And it's just a great, satisfying profession.
So, okay, sort of passing that up a little bit and going back to when you served in the military, because I think, well, not going, won't go into the politics of it all or anything like that, and not interested in sort of war porn stories or anything like that. But um, was it a case of being, I don't know what the word is, enlisted in the army, sort of because you wanted to, or was it part of the um, was it a government program? I think a lot of people won't be familiar with how that worked.
Well, I chose to go to West Point. I was very impressed with the institution. For those who are not familiar, West Point is the United States Army's training university for future military officers. And so I was very impressed with what I saw there: the excellence and the the balance of academic and athletic rigor. And I like leadership. And so that part was pretty clear to me. I probably didn't fully understand this war thing and why people go to war and how that affects people, but I started to see that and
With
realized that there's a lot of things that we're never trained to address. You know, we knew how to tactically function, we knew how to technically function, but we don't prepare our people. And this is true in not just the military, but firefighting, police, and life. Really, we don't prepare people for the emotional aspects, the emotional aftermath.
So I'm interested what it was specifically about the your military experience that made you realize that you wanted to go into psychology as a profession. Was there was there a particular sort of aha moment, a set of events? Just what was it that you were seeing or feeling that was going on that made you think, okay, psychology is the way to go from here?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a snappy answer for you, but I think it was an evolution. I liked working with young people, and as I was getting promoted in the military, you were getting more and more removed from direct contact with those you led. And so I liked working with young people. I liked education. That's when I decided to go into education. And when I went back to graduate school, I had all these engineering and physics credits from West Point. And at the university I was studying at, um, I discovered that there was a health program that would have been, for the same amount of time, I could finish that and teach health, which I was much more interested in. To me, that was a way to combine all the things that help people be at our best. And so I started down the health public health education route. And when I went to Maryland and discovered they had a stress program, I thought, well, this is great, because stress is such a central concern in teaching people how to thrive. And so step by step, and then when I got into the stress management program at Maryland, all the experiences I've had seeing, soldier buddies and seeing young kids struggling and discovering trauma, and then its opposite, resilience, and it all sort of came together. And I wish it was an aha moment. I think it was little by little, but I think that's where life is probably for a lot of us.
Yeah, okay. So that's the perfect segue into my first question, really, which is defining exactly what resilience is. I mean, it's a very vague term, I guess, to the uninitiated. And also, I think people might stick a lot of different definitions onto it by mistake. It could sound like stubbornness, or kind of being emotionally numb, or like having a hard personality. So if you could just give us a clear definition of what resilience is, what it means to be resilient.
Yeah, and I love when I get to train people. If I can get there early, I like to ask people, what do you think it is? And what I found is most people have a sense what it is. They'll say things like it's bouncing back stronger, persisting and coping well. And you hear enough of that. People don't always use all the snazzy words, but you start to get a sense of what it really is. And in the literature, you're right, there are hundreds of definitions, but the one I've settled on is this one. Resilience is those strengths of mind and character that are inborn and capable of being developed. So in other words, we all start out with the seeds of resilience in embryo. And what they do is they help us respond well to adversity, any time. And specifically what resilience is the capacity to prevent all the stress-related problems like depression and anxiety, PTSD. If we get symptoms, then we tend to recover better with those strengths of resilience. And the other side of the coin is resilience helps optimize mental fitness and performance. So it's a lot of things, isn't it? It's a huge topic. It's preventing and helping people recover from disease, but then the opposite end of it, it's helping us be at our best, which is interesting. It's the same skills no matter where we fall on that emotional health continuum.
So would it be fair to say that resilience is best understood not as kind of a thing in and of itself, but as a sort of set of traits and responsive behaviors that combine to make a person resilient?
I think that's a very good way to say it. And I think that you and I have all of those strengths. It's a standard issue. We both got it. You may be stronger in this trait, I may be stronger in that trait. But once we identify those traits, then we can figure out ways to strengthen those attributes. Then we're on the staircase to building better resilience.
Right, and just to clarify as well, so to be unresilient, I don't know if that's actually a word, or to not be resilient, is that a person that's more likely then to succumb to things like anxiety, depression, PTSD? Is resilience, I guess, is it resilience the buffer between a person succumbing to those sort of mental health issues or not doing?
Yes, it is. In fact, some people define PTSD as the loss or absence of resilience. And so for people who are so afflicted, the goal of therapy is to rebuild resilience or to build resilience. Maybe that wasn't fully developed.
Right. Okay. So this is what I'd like to sort of get into now. You mentioned already this idea of innate resiliency and learned resiliency. So let's start with this idea of it being innate. Is it fair to say that kind of, I don't know, that people are born resilient, but then maybe their environment sort of beats it out of them, so to speak? I'm thinking of sort of early childhood adversity and things like that.
Right. I think we're born with the potential, and kids pop into the world at different stages of development. Clearly, anybody who's had more than one child in a family, now kids pop out differently. But no matter where you are on the resilience staircase, we can always go up the staircase. And so I think that's what resilience training does. It says, may be on step one, you may be on step four, but we can both grow our resilience and hopefully keep our resilience above the rising tide of stress. And that to me is the hope and the promise of effective resilience training.
Okay, so I think to think of it, resilience training, we're sort of quite far ahead then. It's almost, I guess, when someone's got some sort of profession that requires it, and we train that person, or someone's been through some sort of trauma, and we're training them. What I'm interested in is how it's learned, how it might be learned in, say, in the family environment. So is the particular family environments or particular childhood experience that tend to create a resilient child or teenager, or the opposite?
Absolutely. I mean, ideally, the family is where we learn it. We learn there's nothing about resilience that can't be taught in the family or the schools. Unfortunately, we often get groups, particularly high-risk groups like soldiers or cops. Now they're adults and they haven't learned these skills, and we throw them into the crucible and say, okay, now's a good time to learn, and maybe they're motivated now because they're suffering. But these are skills that can be taught, and that's really my goal in life is to train parents so that they feel confident to teach their children. Once you see what are the particular strengths and what are the skills associated with those strengths, this isn't rocket science. For example, parents can teach their children about the common thought patterns that make us more prone to depression or trauma. There's only 12 of these, and anybody can learn this from a book or a teacher. So I think that's the hope of resilience. It's not brain surgery.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, I've not done much research on this topic, of course, just, a little bit sort of going into it to speak to you, but just kind of in my own little bro sciencey way, I'm imagining that a family environment that's where you're sort of mollycoddled and a little too much protection, I'm thinking surely that creates somebody who's not resilient. People who are shielded from adversity, they're not going to cultivate resilience. But then on the flip side of that, I guess if a child's in a sort of a horrendous environment where there's violence or whatever, and it's hopeless, then the resilience is sort of beaten out of them as well. But then it sounds like this weird middle ground for where you want your child to have an okay life and you want to look after them to a certain extent, but you also want some bad things to happen to them, but things that aren't too bad. Does that make sense? I know that's a sort of very amateurish way of looking at it, but I'm just wondering if
it's not amateurish at all, and it's exactly right. By the way, most of psychology is common sense, I think, plus some skills that maybe we don't come up with on our own. But go back to the World War II generation, which I spent 5 years traveling the country in America to interview, and also interviewed a Brit who landed in Normandy. They had a rough. They suffered through the Depression, hard work. And so these were not mollycoddled people. But what did they have? They had almost invariably, among the people I interviewed who were combat survivors and well-functioning, well-married people, they grew up typically with close-knit families who taught discipline and hard work and values and all those things that tend to make us stronger under adversity. Now you fast forward to our kids today, and you see more kids who are growing up in homes where a parent is absent or using drugs or drinking. There's mental health issues. There's less spirituality in the family. and then you have the hovering parents who feel like they have to protect their kids from any challenge. But you're right, the middle ground says, I'm going to give you a secure base. You're going to know in my family you're loved and you have potential and I believe in you, but I'm not going to hand things to you. You're going to have to learn how to work for them. And in the process, we get confident, we get stronger. And so, yeah, that's a perfect place to teach all these principles and skills in the family.
Yeah, it's I've got to say, as a parent though, it's it's tricky to allow yourself to sort of back off from from certain things and let your child make mistakes. And this is going to sound horrendously sexist, but it's just true. So I've got a little boy, 7 years old, and um, I've just had a little girl as well. She's like 8, 9 months now, and I can already see the level of sort of protection I feel for my daughter is a lot more intense than it was for my little boy. And yeah, I don't want to. I'm guessing that resilience is also something that parents could do with learning as well as just people themselves, because you know I want to protect my children to the best of my ability, but at the same time, I don't want them to turn out soft and to end up like me, to be honest, Glenn, because I I feel like I wasn't resilient enough, which is why I ended up in the predicament I did with struggling with anxiety and panic attacks and things like that. I'm interested what you think of at the moment with there's a lot of things seems to be going on with universities and stuff where they're having all this sort of safe spaces environment, and people aren't allowed to sort of get into discussions with one another and face off against each other with, you know, political and philosophical arguments, and everybody's being sort of protected from that. And I just wonder if you think places like universities are doing the wrong thing with that.
Well, just like a parent can enable a child to be passive and in the process be less confident, universities, I think, can do the very same thing. We can overprotect our kids. Well, life is hard enough. All you got to do is put a person out there, and they'll have to learn how to cope without our overprotecting them. And so, yeah, I think at any level we can hover and overprotect. You know, again, the principle is create a secure, safe place, equip people with the skills and principles, and let them go. We don't have to over worry and overprotect because people are pretty strong. Kids are pretty strong. Um, a lot of parents will not talk to the kids about anything difficult, thinking they have to shield them. When at their own level, they can deal with just about anything if you give them the facts and in a calm way explain this is what we're dealing with. They can pretty well adapt.
Okay, before we kind of jump into the sort of the tools and techniques that people can use to cultivate resilience, one thing I was interested in is whether there's any sort of difference between resilience to sort of long-term stresses and then resilience to sort of catastrophic events. Whether it's whether there's a difference there in what's to be learned in people's personalities. I'm thinking things like being resilient to when someone's going through financial hardship and it's something it's going on for years, maybe with debts and bailiffs and letters through the door and problems with the courts and things like that, and just staying resilient in those situations, and whether there's anything different about a catastrophic event, say like the death of a loved one or something like that.
That's a great question, Danny. I think think about a basket with all the strengths and skills required to be resilient throughout life. A soldier or a cop in crisis can pick out a few of those and cope with an emergency pretty well, but they may not have the skills afterwards to deal with the emotions that follow. And so you can be trained in certain skills like we do in our military. This is what you do when you're in a firefight, and here's how you cope technically and tactically. without ever addressing the other important skills. And so I think civilians learn from military, military can learn from civilians. We all need all of the tools. We don't need some of the tools because what we're seeing is, you know, we train Navy SEALs to be excellent in combat, but not all those Navy SEALs come back and can connect with others in civilian life because they haven't exercised and built social skills. Maybe a soldier comes back from war, they were terrific tactically, but don't know how to deal with their kids who are not in combat. They're in a normal growing up setting where you have to exercise patience and collaboration and explain more than you do in combat. So they're all important. And I don't, you know, people say, well, give me skills because I'm a cop. And I say, well, terrific, let's do that. But let's also broaden your skills because you're also a parent or a spouse. And so we all need all of those skills.
Yeah, okay, final question. Again, my next final question before we get into the practicalities of it is, I'm wondering if resilience is something that can only be cultivated before you sort of pushed over the edge, before you sort of mentally break, so to speak. I'm imagining somebody that's before they've hit rock bottom, before they've been traumatized. It's sort of it's understandable how somebody could cultivate these different skills, learn these sort of tools and techniques to inoculate them from or prepare them for certain events. Whereas I'm just thinking, I imagine, I think I'm talking personally, to be honest. I'm wondering that if after you feel like you've fallen off a cliff, you feel like you've snapped, so to speak, whether can you really cultivate resilience then? Can you rise back up and be resilient? Or are you just sort of dealing with sort of cleaning up the trauma then?
Those are great questions. And the answer is yes. I think ideally the best time is to teach resilience preventively so people don't have to suffer as much. But there's no ideal path in life. And so sometimes we learn resilience during a trial or a crisis where you go, gosh, I'm functioning in this part of the adversity better than I thought. I have a strength I never knew was there. That's another way to cultivate resilience. And then a lot of times looking back, we go, you know what? I didn't do so well. Maybe there are more skills I need to learn. And if there is a beauty of suffering, it's that, you know, we start out with this upward reach and then we all get derailed. And then we try to heal and recover, and that's not a linear process. But in the recovery process, we learn skills we didn't know going into the trial. And those skills propel us throughout the rest of our life. So resilience can be taught and learned any point in life. You know, I want to get people before they're in crisis, but I'll take people during and after as well. And that's
Right.
the hope
Okay.
of resilience.
Right. Okay. So, well, that's what I'd like to do now. And I think if we can sort of, like you were saying, I guess it can be kind of very context specific about building resilience in different environments. What I think would be good for the listeners would be just I'm interested in just some basic sort of resilience training, things that people can do that are just going to sort of help them cope with the general everyday. And when I say general everyday, I'm not talking about, you know, someone cuts you off in traffic and things like that, but the things that, yeah, well, I guess your average, to keep it in a military context, the thing that your average civilian is going to come up against. So if you could sort of, I don't know, get us started with what we, you know, what's the first thing somebody can be doing?
Well, I started like you. I want to get my arms around this thing we call resilience. And so I looked at the literature and I studied people in combat and tried to figure out what are the strengths that keep people highly functional, not just in combat, but throughout life. And I came up with about 16 strengths. And once you identify those strengths, like um, autonomy and self-esteem and optimism and happiness and moral integrity and emotional intelligence and happiness, and there are about 16 that you find never perfectly in one person, but sprinkled across people who tend to be relatively resilient. And then you ask, okay, for each of those strengths, what skills, what principles can build those strengths? And so that's where I started. So in the model that I developed, and I think I'm the first person to use the term resilience training, this notion that we can actually train people to become more resilient. I start with strengthening what I call brain hardware. If you think of the brain as analogous to a computer, resilience, all the software is resilience principles and skills. These can be taught. But if the hardware of a computer is sluggish, the software doesn't work well. So I start by optimizing brain hardware. And there are like 9 keys to doing that. And by hardware, I mean the number of neurons or brain cells, their size and health, and their function. So I want a brain that's really a sharp organ. And you do that by Mediterranean diet and exercise and sufficient sleep, which most of us adults in the Western culture are getting less and less with each passing decade. Um, Avoiding certain medications that are harmful and pollution and preservatives and those kind of things. Treating diseases that are known to impair brain health, like sleep apnea and thyroid problems, all of which are very treatable. Gum disease, diabetes, getting sufficient sunshine. Um, so you start by strengthening the brain, and then you're ready. And by the way, in my resilience course at the university, a lot of the kids said this was the most important part of resilience for me, because I knew all this stuff, but when I was kind of forced to make a structure and have a health plan and get good food and nutrition and eating and exercise, those basics are vital. So that goes a long way toward preparing us for the software, the resilience skills.
Well, let me just stop you there, Glenn, because my immediate reaction to that is, so I mean, I've read quite broadly on mental health. Like you say, things like sleep and nutrition and exercise are vital, but the tricky concepts to convince people of, because I think they sound like exercise, for instance. Now, if anyone goes away and reads about John Ratey, some of the research he's done on why exercise is quite literally, and I'm not one of those that throws the word literally around, but exercise can quite literally work as an anxiety drug or an antidepressant. Mm-hmm. If you actually sit and read the book, the full 300 pages, you'll be convinced of it. But I think when you kind of throw these ideas out, there's no way that we could go. I think you said there was 9 facets. There's no way we can go through all 9 in this podcast. We'd be here all day. These are each a topic of their own. But how do you, as someone that's working with people, how do you convince people? Because it's one of those where people know this stuff, but they don't realize it. I think that's the best way to put it. We know we should look after our heart by doing cardio and stuff. We know that, but we don't realize it until we have a heart attack, and then we get given a second chance. So what do you say to people to really kind of drive that point home, that no, it's not just airy fairy. Exercise, sleep, nutrition really is vital?
Well, I love the idea of training in a small group. Groups of 8 to 14 people, which is what we pioneered at the university and also the Pentagon. When people get in a group and they say, okay, here's our starting point, here's the principles, here's the skills, go home and try it, come back 2 days later and we'll talk about how it's going. when people do that, and in a structured way, and so I give people log sheets and, make your own plan. I don't care if you're sleeping 6 hours a day, if your new plan is 6 hours and a quarter, that's a good start. If it's 7.5, maybe you kick it up to 7.75 hours, and make a plan. Here's the principles. Here's the ideal diet, Mediterranean-like diet. Make a plan that's as best as you can do. And then when they come back in a group and one person said, I did this and actually it wasn't as hard as I thought, or I did this and it was hard, let's problem solve together. Then all the things that we know up here start to be implemented, and we start to build each other and support each other. And one success leads to another. And by the way, that's a great way to start building emotional bonds in a group. That's a fairly safe place to start, easy stuff, non-threatening stuff. And then over the weeks and months, we start building emotional bonding that allows people the freedom to talk about what's really some of the weightier issues.
Okay, so big on peer support. Again, though, that's I know it's something that people in the sort of the self-help realm find tricky. I know I haven't.
It's tricky. It's tricky for me too, but that's where you start by saying, what can you do? Forget the ideal for a moment. Is there a step in the right direction? And one step leads to another. But it's very difficult to get past the foundations if you ignore the foundation stones, and those are critical. And the proof is in the pudding. Once people start, they usually go, why have I waited so long?
Yeah, I think, well, my little tip for people that are sort of introverted and a bit of a social rattlesnake like myself, is if you haven't got like a peer support group around you and you really are sort of going this alone, don't do this. Don't do it for you. Do it for the people around you. Like, hold yourself accountable to the people around you, even if you don't share it, that you're doing it for them. For me, that was the most powerful thing, especially with having kids and stuff. It's I've really got to get my shit together because I've got kids. So yeah, that'd be my little tip, is just try and hold yourself accountable to other people.
And not overwhelm. I mean, people get overwhelmed, especially when they're depressed or anxious, and you just go, what little steps can you take? And that's usually its own reward. Just go, I'm going to do this because I feel better when I do it.
Yeah, that was something for me, is kind of, I think you get these big lofty goals in mind. So say, early on, before I knew much about this, I'd buy books on CBT, and it was like, okay, so they say do the book for 12 weeks with the written exercises, and you tell yourself, right, well, in 12 weeks, if I stick to it, then, in 12 weeks, my depression will be gone, my life will be sorted, and I'll, sort of turn into this Buddhist monk who's just in this state of transcendental bliss. And then, but when you get to the end of that 12 weeks and that's not what happened, it can be pretty devastating. Whereas I think if you just, like you say, win every day, just wake up in the morning and you've only got a win today, forget 12 weeks, 16 weeks, or whatever it is, just do what you need to do today, win today. And then you're proud of yourself every day. And the other thing is, a string of victories then just automatically turn into a bigger victory, whether you were aiming for that or not. So again, that's my little tip. I always just tell myself that just win today. Forget out there in the ethereal future. So let's assume that someone gets those things in order. And again, I'll just add this on. Getting your diet in order doesn't mean eating rabbit food and salads. It might just mean just stop with the McDonald's 3 times a day. And with the exercising, it doesn't mean cardio for an hour every single day. It might just mean 20 minutes twice a week to start off with. So let's assume somebody's doing that. What's the next step?
Okay. So the model, the framework I follow, we start with regulating arousal because, and from anxiety challenges, that if you're over aroused, it's very difficult to function at your best. And so the model that I've come to use now is it's not just over stress arousal, it's getting stuck on too little arousal. Like that's when people go numb, and that happens in trauma, and it happens in anxiety and depression. And so what we're trying to do is get people back into the resilience zone where arousal fluctuates smoothly within a window that promotes rational thinking and verbalization. And so there are a lot of really neat new skills, like body-based skills. Like most of Western psychology is up here and talking. And a lot of times people who are very stressed aren't able to talk. You know, traumatic stress usually plays out at the parts of the brain below the thought and the verbal level, and you can't talk your way out of that. And so there's a whole bottom-up body-based approach, which starts at let's just get our bodies back into that resilience zone. And when you do that, parts of the brain come back online, thinking, logic parts, the verbal parts. It's something as simple as, you know, if you're really overstressed, instead of, you know, it's good when you can talk it through and get at the distortions, the thought distortions, but maybe put all that aside for a minute and do something physically. It might be as simple as just kneading your arm, going up and down your arm, pressing it different ways until you find a way that feels good. Put your awareness in your body, because when you do that, parts of the brain that connects your sense of self to your body and to your emotions comes back online. All these parts of the brain that go offline when you're in survival mode. So movement, gestures, resourcing, where you just think about something that gave you pleasure, recall it in detail. So very simple things like that. There's some wonderful techniques, heart coherence, where you just feel love in your heart. Any positive emotion experienced at the heart level makes your heart do this instead of this. And when you do this, the brain and the gut do that in sync. So all the parts of your body start functioning well just by the simple experience. You do this in 2 minutes at a time. Recall it an experience of love. There's some wonderful new research on, I might call it mindfulness extended. We know from a lot of research that mindfulness practice is very effective, but then Kristen Neff added to mindfulness practice something she calls self-compassion. And that is not just being mindfully aware of what's going on within and without, but actively bringing kindness into your day-to-day living. So to go to your exercise example, okay, I didn't exercise. I can kick myself and beat myself up, or I can say, put your hand over your heart and go, this is hard. There's a lot of things going on. Everybody suffers, but may I bring kindness to this day? So instead of judging and whipping, we learn to just be kind. And that's a big theme in resilience. Love is at the heart of resilience. Kindness, compassion, whatever you call it. It's true with soldiers, though they don't call it love, they may call it respect. But when you get used to saying, this is life, this is training, this is not perfection, and I'm trying my best, and that's good enough. Yes, I want to get better, but I'm going to be kind in the process. When I interviewed the World War II soldiers, I just concluded that these were great lovers. They loved people, they loved their country and freedom, and it was at the heart of resilience. And science since has shown that when we experience love, everything changes physically. And when we change physically, our brain changes. So it's not an unscientific conclusion, I don't think anymore, and I'm not as reluctant to say it, but love for others, love for self is at the root of resilience. And so it's not only psychological skills, although they can be helpful, but it's a shift in the way we relate to ourselves and to others, which is why healthy self-esteem is such a big part of resilience. I don't mean the goofy stuff that says everything you do is wonderful. I mean, I'm quietly glad to be who I am. I'm worthwhile, and so are you.
I've got to ask, Glenn, as a military man, and not just someone that was in the army, but someone that continued to work in that context. When you were doing this research and you were coming across these concepts of things like mindfulness and self-compassion, did you struggle to internalize that at all?
Sure.
To believe it?
Don't we all? I mean, I think a baby is born open to love. And then we learn how to close off when people criticize or make fun of you or tell you you're a loser. And so for most people, I think we need to learn or relearn to be open to love. Think about it. Forgiveness is really loving your offender, even though they did something horrific. That's not easy. It's a learned skill. To be kind to yourself when maybe mom or dad were critical is a learned skill. But once we learn it, we change for the good. We're better parents because hopefully we can teach our kids to be loving to self and others when we're less than perfect. And that's a huge skill.
Yeah, it's the self-compassion one is one that I definitely struggle with that. Very, very hard on myself all the time. I mean, and this is knowing all the CBT stuff, the cognitive distortions. I know all this stuff, but when and I preach it as well, I try and I teach it to other people. But when it comes to me, that's a tricky one to make it into a habit.
Right.
It's almost like I can hear the voice, I can hear the saying, you should be practicing a little self-compassion here, and I'm just like, shut up, because I'm pissed off and I'm disappointed, so I'm not interested. But what I will say about the mindfulness thing, that was a really interesting one for me. Mindfulness and meditation was definitely something, when I first heard that, it's like twaddle, like there's no way that works. But when I just shut up and actually gave it a go, and I was, again, like we were kind of talking about before, it was one of them things where I did it for 2 days and then it didn't change my life, so obviously it doesn't work. And then I'd go back to it and I'd do it for a week on and off. But then when I finally did it for 30 days in a row, the way I describe meditation, the kind of effect it has is you can't feel things changing along that 30 days. But when you get to the 30 days and look backwards, just something shifted. The mind's a little clearer. You're less reactive. I don't quite know what it is, what's happening, but there's definitely a tangible shift. And so I definitely recommend that to anybody with anxiety, depression, etc. But this is from a bearded wannabe masculine man type thing. I know it sounds a bit fluffy, but if I've tried it, you can try it.
It might sound fluffy, but not at all to me, because like you, I taught meditation as part of the university stress courses for decades. And it was never my favorite. I taught it dutifully. And then one day I finished a book early and I said, I've always wanted to go to a yoga ashram, find out what they do there. So I did. And there was one in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. And the fellow who was at the head was this Sri Swami Satchidananda. And he's a real bubby. He'd been all around the world in pictures with the Pope and the presidents. But he framed up meditation in a way that I hadn't really thought about. He said, meditation, there are a million techniques, but what really at its essence meditation is, it's coming in contact with our true happy nature. In other words, inside we're already have the capacity to be happy. We just got to get under those thoughts. And that's where cognitive therapy plays, at the thought level. And they say, and mindfulness too, thoughts is the problem. Get under the thoughts and just reconnect with what's already there, your true, happy, loving nature. All the things we associate with resilience are already there. So just breathe, get in contact with that. And for the first time I go, oh, this is why people have meditated for thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly.
In any culture, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, it's a beautiful experience. And it is a cell job. especially in the macho professions where, I'm tough and I got to be strong. Well, this makes you a better soldier. It makes you a better parent. It doesn't make you a worse or a weaker parent.
Okay, I've got some like philosophical questions around this about people actually sort of adopting certain lenses through which to view the world, which might help with this. But I can imagine there's some people like, well, we're talking about the masculine men, those sorts. They'll be listening to this and thinking, maybe they want something that just feels a bit more. Maybe it's tricky to connect how things like mindfulness and the exercise, meditation, self-compassion, how that makes for resilience. And so I'm just wondering if there is anything in there that people can think about, people can do, which does feel much more like it's an exercise that makes you feel sturdier as a person, something that's well, I guess it makes you harder and more galvanized, so that you feel like, well, when this big event comes along or whatever life's going to throw at me, rather than feeling like I can sort of distance myself from my thoughts and be mindful through the process, that I can really sort of stand tall and deal with the shit that's thrown at me. I'm just wondering if there's anything more in that guise that people can practice.
Yes, and it's not going to be the answer that a lot of people will think. I'm interested in people having inner strength, inner security. I'm not interested in how we appear to others. And a lot of what we teach people is to look strong rather than to heal and be strong, so that you're 100% there for your buddies and your friends and yourself. So we ask the question, what is it that gives people inner strength, inner security? We can shine our shoes and stand at attention and look strong, and we can lift weights and be physically strong. And that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But I want you to be the best soldier, the best cop, the best parent, teacher, coach, manager. And now I think we're going to the deeper inner strengths of resilience. And so what I found with my World War II veterans, this was a highly moral group. They spoke of chaste courtships and fidelity in marriage and never mistreating civilians or POWs or their buddies. And so they never had these inner conflicts and regrets. They came back from the war with as much inner peace as you can, having been through the brutality of war. It was a very faith-filled group. And we don't read about that in the psychology books, but you can be a strong leader and have strong, quiet inner faith. Not that you need to tell other people what to believe, but once we take the time and the effort to cultivate our spirituality, that has huge payoffs. I came across a story just the other day about a fellow who was, he survived the Bataan Death March. 70 miles, 78,000 Americans and Filipinos were forced to march, disease ravaged, starving, no water, and if you fell out, you're bayoneted. And then for 2.5 years, they were slave laborers by the bestial Japanese, who said, well, we're going to work you to death, and they literally meant that. And so this guy, in his account, said, my enemy was not the emperor, it was not the Japanese, who were just like Americans, some good, some bad. The real enemy was loss of hope. He said, we saw this all the time in the prison camps, where people would get in a semi-fetal position and have a distant stare looking at nothing, and then they'd be dead, even though they weren't the most sick necessarily. And then he said, I reached that point in my captivity where I didn't want to go on living. And I threw my shovel down and said to the Japanese guard, I will no longer work. And the Japanese guard beat him, and he went to his bed to die. And as he was ready to die, he opened up his letter from his mother, and he started recalling the love of his family, and he prayed. And he said, somehow the next day I woke up with a determination to live. And he lived and he survived, whereas 24 hours before he was dying of the illness of lack of hope. And he said, I'd overcome my enemy. Now, you can talk about optimism in psychology, but there's a hope that spirituality gives you that is deeper than hope, than optimism, rather. And that's like any other skill, it's cultivated. But we're so busy today with business and computers and golf that we don't nourish the spiritual side of us, which is the source of our strength. So it's perhaps not the answer a lot of people look for, but I think it's critical.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that whether so firstly, just to clarify, spirit, are we talking spirituality as synonymous with religion?
I personally, people tend to separate those two, and I think healthy spirituality, healthy religious practice go together quite naturally. Because what is religion?
The,
It's a search for the sacred.
yeah, I mean, the only tricky part to that seems to be that I think maybe whether it's religion or spirituality is it's do you not think spirituality tends to be sort of based on a belief system, and belief isn't necessarily something you can sort of switch on or off, is it? You either you do or you don't. And I'm just wondering, for those people that um for those people that don't have a spiritual side and maybe have no interest in cultivating a spiritual side, there is sort of these sort of hardcore atheist types. Is there a way to arrive at the same destination in the absence of spirituality? Because I don't know if don't allow me to speak for you, but from what you were saying, it sounded very similar to me. Like there's a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is an amazing book, which I definitely recommend to people.
I think it's required reading for resilience.
Oh, are you familiar with it? Oh, it's such an amazing book. The take-home message for me there was that just that is finding meaning in life, in having something, a bigger understanding of things, something bigger to shoot for. And I'm just wondering if you feel that would have the same effect as being spiritual or religious or whichever.
Well, I think meaning and purpose is one of those key strengths of resilience. So certainly cultivating meaning and purpose. Now, you can make the same argument. Well, I don't have a sense of meaning and purpose. You either have it or you don't. And I say we can cultivate that. And there are skills and there are questionnaires that kind of stimulate our thinking along those lines. But the things that make us happy, the things that make us resilient, don't necessarily fall in our laps without effort. We cultivate. And just like we cultivate meaning and purpose, we can cultivate spirituality / religious practice. I think religion gets a bad rap, but if you look at the research, those who practice fare better in just about any way you look at resilience in terms of recovery from depression and living longer and being mentally healthy and more maritally satisfied. And so you never say, well, do this or do that. But if that's part of your inclination, are you availing yourself of spiritual / religious resources? And you offer menus. You never say do this or do that. But I always say, what might you be willing to try, whether it's meaning and purpose or spirituality or a particular type of religious practice. The benefits are well documented, and I think you don't read about that in the psychology books because of the history of its development. But I'm satisfied having interviewed these folks who get through that to a large degree it's their faith that helped them endure. And even Viktor Frankl, who I very much respect, said, I won't tell you how to find meaning and purpose in your life because that's something you've got to discover. But as I think about what he said and what he wrote, much of what he said and what he wrote is about loving, helping people elevate self and others. Very much overlap with the spiritual practices throughout history.
Okay, so before we sort of start wrapping this up, an interesting quote I came across was well, it's sort of a definition of resilience, or people's attitude towards resilience. Excuse me, and it's from the University of Rochester. And it just, of all the little things I'd read about resilience in the past week, this one stood out to me. And they said that resilience research is focused on studying those who engage in life with hope and humor despite devastating losses. And that stood out to me because those two facets were things that were hugely important for me in coming back from the darkest place that I went to. Is having hope for the future and feeling like things could get better. So much so that I actually named my daughter Hope, just dedicated to that time of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that's been massively important to me is humor. Is just seeing the humor in my situation, and that can get quite dark at times when you're talking about mental health issues. And I've even come across people that have told me that I shouldn't laugh at my own situation, and that it doesn't matter what I think. Mental health issues are very serious. There's nothing funny about it. But for me, I wouldn't have got through those times without it. So I'm just wondering whether there's any kind of, like, hope and humor aren't techniques, are they? They are, like I say, the philosophical lenses through which we view the world. And so I was just wondering if there was anything similar to that you feel on a philosophical level, things that ways of seeing, ways of being, besides what we've just spoken about, the spiritual aspect, that again help people cultivate this.
Absolutely. And you're right. Hope and humor are two of those 15 or 16 strengths. So they're very important. They're not the whole picture, are they? But as you just so beautifully said, they can be life saving. So if you think about it, there's helpful humor and there's humor that's not so helpful. And the kind that's helpful is the kind of humor that says, sure, I can laugh at the ridiculous things I do sometimes, but we're all in the same boat and we've all got worth despite our imperfections. So humor that's wholesome and uplifting, as opposed to hostile humor, like sarcasm that puts you down, or self-deprecating humor, like Rodney Dangerfield. That's funny for 5 minutes, but it doesn't play out over the long haul. But there's a kind of humor that we can laugh together. And all the World War II guys that I interviewed, that was key to their survival. So I think there's a healthy, wholesome humor that's a wonderful thing. Hope is a wonderful thing, but it's a nice concept, but sometimes you have to work to have hope. You have to start being active instead of passive. It's very hard to be hopeful when you're passive and hoping things will happen to you for the good. So hope and active coping go together. And again, little steps. It's not where you are, it's what the course is and what direction you're in.
Yeah, what's the saying is, where you are is not as important as where you're going. I love that saying.
That's really good, yeah.
So, but again, is there any others aside from those, which are maybe more in the philosophical realm, just things for, I say, just tips for ways of seeing, maybe things that for people to reconsider their situation. And I'm not sort of fishing for some sort of clever quote or epiphany or anything like that. I'm more looking at, let's say, things people can do, or books, or any kind of resources that you sort of point people in that direction and say, maybe consider this.
Yeah, that's an easier question to answer. I wrote the resilience workbook putting together all of the stuff we've been talking about and all the trainings we've developed at the Pentagon and the University of Maryland. But there's a resource section at the back identifying some of my very favorite books, including Man's Search for Meaning.
Is that in your recommended reading?
It is. I think it's,
yeah.
There's another one that I consider required reading called In My Hands. Have you heard about this one?
I've not heard that one, no.
Irene Gut Updike was a Polish girl in nursing school when the Nazis invaded. And after she bandaged the carnage, she volunteered to flee to the Ukraine with the Polish army. And there she was captured and raped by the Russians. And then when she finally escaped and made her way back to Germany, she was conscripted as a slave laborer. She was discovered by a Nazi major because she was beautiful and she looked Aryan. She spoke Polish and beautiful German. And he said, "You will take care of my quarters and you'll work in the laundry and serve food to the German officers." Well, anyway, long story short, eventually she moved into this beautiful house built by a Jewish architect that the German major commandeered. And so while he lived upstairs, she hid 12 Jews in the basement. And he eventually discovered what she'd done and forced her to be his mistress. But she got all of those Jews to safety and maintained contact with them until her recent death. But here was a woman who, when I read her book, I thought, is she going to be hard? Is she going to be cynical because of what she went through? She'd stayed soft inside, hopeful, loving, kind, altruistic. And to me, that's real resilience. But she functioned as a partisan throughout World War II. But she didn't get hard on the outside. She stayed soft inside while she was strong on the outside. So In My Hands is another great book. There are some others that I really like. There's one called Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss, which says,
really?
You're going to do great things in life, except when you don't, because sometimes you won't. And people are going to love you, except when they don't, because sometimes they won't. One of my graduate students gave that to me because she said it was basically what we were teaching. And it's a very humorous book, but there's some profound truths that, be a little kind, try your best, strive for excellence, but realize you're going to come up short as you strive and continue to strive. So my background is military. I believe in working hard and doing your best and striving for excellence, but you gotta balance that with kindness and love. And even in leadership, it's love that people respond to. It's well documented in the research. They don't care about your technical knowledge nearly as much as they care. Do you care about me as a person?
Yeah, I've got to say it's quite a reassuring message to end on. I think is that even during the course of this interview, I sometimes struggle to separate the concept of resilience from hardness, and I just think it's reassuring to know that it doesn't need to be that. Even if you don't feel tough or galvanized inside, if you don't feel like that sort of person, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not resilient. You don't have to turn into that person. And even if you don't feel hard, it doesn't mean that adversity is necessarily going to break you when it does come along. And so I just think that's quite a reassuring message. And I think it's reassuring as well, just because for some people, if resilience did mean becoming emotionally numb or hard or whatever, that might be too distant a goal or too much of a personality shift. And you might think, well, that's just never going to be me. But like you say, when you kind of bring these different aspects in, these aspects of spirituality and mindfulness, that's attainable for everybody. And so again, I think that's very reassuring.
Brilliant perspective. Instead of resilience being heartless, I think of it as being heartful. You think of the word courage. In Latin and French, what's the root? Core, heart. Love is what gives us the impetus, the strength to be courageous. It's what gives us the strength to be resilient. And so that's a little bit of a hard sell to these kids that are kind of coming from crummy family environments and they want to be tough and not feel. And I say, feel it doesn't make you weak. It'll make you a better soldier that won't break. And it's true across the spectrum of life in any field we're in.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on that, Glenn. But before I let you go, I am going to submit you to my quickfire questions. Before I do that, though, so it's the Resilience Workbook: Essential Skills to Recover from Stress, Trauma, and Adversity. Is that book already out in the US? Because it's got a future release date in the UK.
It's out in the US. Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. Just came out the beginning of this month.
Yeah, and I think it's got a UK release date as well. I think it's something like December 27th. So perfect time for the whole New Year, January 1st type thing. Get stuck into the book for the new year. Okay, so quick fire questions. Firstly, if you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?
I would start teaching the course we taught at the University of Maryland and that I do with the high-risk groups and put that into the grade schools. Because like I said, it's not jet science. It's, with a little simplification, it can be taught to young kids. Kids are amazing when you present the skills they pick up.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a broad generalization, this, and it might not be the same for everyone everywhere. But it seems to me there's a lot on mental health awareness going on at the moment, and especially in like schools and colleges, it's all about mental health awareness. Whereas I'm kind of a bit. We were saying that resilience is, if resilience is the buffer between somebody being okay and developing mental health issues, I think it's more important to sort of develop that preventative strategy rather than just awareness. So I wish there was
exactly
there was more on that. Yeah.
Awareness usually has a disease focus after the fact, and we're talking about preventive skills before crisis hits. So yeah, it's very different. It's not information that changes people, it's skills, coping skills.
Yeah.
And that's just like teaching golf. You don't just hear a lecture, you got to practice skills, come back and talk about it, tweak it, try it again. And then they become part of your coping repertoire instead of just head knowledge, which doesn't stay there during crisis.
Okay. What, if anything, keeps you up at night? What worries you?
I worry that the young people today don't have the same environment I did. It's very, very different today. And these kids are suffering because of it, higher rates of depression and anxiety and trauma. And what I had was the community I described at the beginning of our interview is a community where mom and dad were home with the kids a good proportion of the time. There was a sense of community, and we could go out and run around and get physical exercise, and they can't do that today for fear of being kidnapped or terrorized. So I think the kids today need this more than we did.
Okay. What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Boy, that's a great one. Can I do two?
Of course. Yeah, the more the better.
I think at West Point, we were forced, as part of the hazing, to memorize a passage on leadership. It's the best leadership passage I ever learned, and I can still probably mostly quote it verbatim. It's that the discipline which makes the soldiers of a free country reliable in battle is not to be gained by harsh or tyrannical treatment. On the contrary, such treatment is far more likely to destroy than to make an army. It is possible to impart instructions and give commands in such manner and such tone of voice as to inspire in the soldier no feeling but intense desire to obey, while the opposite manner and tone of voice cannot fail to inspire disrespect and desire to disobey. That one mode or the other of dealing with subordinates springs from the corresponding spirit in the breast of the commander. He who feels the respect which is due to others, especially his subordinates, cannot fail to inspire respect, while the opposite manner and tone of voice cannot fail to inspire disrespect. And probably messed it up a little bit, but the general principle there is a good leader understands that if you treat people with respect, with regard, like they're capable, and I found this in my leadership experience, they will respond beautifully. It's also a resilient culture. Um, I think the other thing that I've learned over the years, and this goes back to my spiritual perspective, is that God is a loving God, and I think He's delighted when we try our best. Not that we're being perfect, but that we keep on trying and picking ourselves up. Um, and that's where the hope and the peace comes from. And we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be doing our best. And that's what any parent would ask of their kids. It's all we can ask of each other.
Okay. And what I'll do is that first quote you gave, I'll include that in the show notes for people to actually have a good read through and sort of really pick it apart. Okay.
It's in my book, actually. It's in my
book, is it?
The Resilience Workbook, yeah. So we
Right,
can
okay.
get verbatim without any mistakes.
Okay. What mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
I think in the pursuit of excellence, we can get too locked on immediate results. And I do get impatient. You know, I want to do really, really well, really, really quick. And I have to remind myself this is a process. We don't, as humans, perfect overnight. It's a process. So I think being patient with myself and others that I love. It's a process. I try to do better all the time. And you know this as a parent. You know, we don't always do it perfectly, do we?
We definitely don't. No.
But even there, I mean, part of resilience is saying, you know what, you're trying, you're doing a lot of things well, and so keep it up. You can do it.
Okay, final two. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
I think working with the youth at church, and I just love being able to share my experiences, things I wish I'd heard when I was 18, you know, and kind of in that protected environment, not anticipating the real challenges. Tell me the question again.
It was outside of family and academia, because
Okay.
it's easy to pick those two. Whatever's give you the most joy or fulfillment, an investment of time or money.
Yeah, to me, definitely the spiritual stuff. I mean, the peace that I feel, it comes from that. You know, I think my career stuff, I love it. I wouldn't give it up, but it's not at the end of the day what really gives me the greatest joy. It's inner peace kind of stuff. I love going to the beach. Can I throw that in?
Of course, yeah.
We just moved here, and I go there when I need a few minutes to unwind and breathe. You know, trying to exercise and go to a movie and dinner every once in a while, and read uplifting works. Try not so much to turn on the television, which is mostly negative and passive. It's another thing that's different today than it was 50 years ago.
Okay. The final one, the big one. What do you think is the key to happiness?
I think happiness is key to resilience, and I think happiness is an inside job. It's not a function of how much money we make. It's a function of realizing that our life matters, that we're capable of doing very good things, and having a peace of conscience, knowing that, you know, I made mistakes, but I'm doing my best and I'm trying to correct whatever things I do wrong, and that there is hope beyond this life. This life is not the greatest all the time, but there's hope. I'm in no hurry to finish my experience here, but I think there's great promises ahead of us.
Perfect note to end on, Glenn. So, before we say the bye-byes and everything, if you could, have you got any links, social media, websites, your chance to plug away to the listener?
I do. Thanks for asking. My website is www.resiliencefirst.com. Resiliencefirst.com. And there you can see the books that I've written and get my email address. So yeah, that's up there.
Okay, and don't forget the book, the Resilience Workbook. Perfect gift for well, maybe for Christmas, but definitely for New Year. If you're in the UK, you have to wait till New Year. So, Glenn Schiraldi, thank you very much.
Danny, it was a pleasure. Thanks for such insightful, thoughtful questions.